Hi, kids. Here we are for another installment of The Tiger Rising. We're on chapter 21. There was something else important that I didn't say yesterday about the last thing Beauchamp said to Rob. He said, "This is our business deal. Don't tell anybody. I'll keep bringing you meat and keep your mouth shut." So, of course, Rob, I think you could tell he's not going to follow that advice, and he told Sistine, and like I said, that's going to set up the conflict for the rest of the book. And then at the end of the chapter, Sistine had a big, angry tantrum and was crying, which really shocked Rob because she's so tough. And he tried to comfort her. So, chapter 21. By the time they started, I forgot to say, I wrote down a few things. So for chapter 21, I wrote the word materialized. So think about what that means when I read it in the chapter, listen for it. And there's a simile, got it, snapping out of you like, she's talking to, I'll talk about it at the end. And then prophetess. So think about what a prophetess is, what that person does. It's related to the word prophet and prophecy. Chapter 21 again. By the time they started walking back to the Kentucky Star, it was dusk. Sistine was not crying, but she wasn't talking either, not even about letting the tiger go. "I have to call my mother," she said to him in a tired voice when they got to the motel. "I'll go with you," said Rob. She didn't tell him not to, so he walked with her across the parking lot. They were almost to the laundry room when Willie May materialized out of the purple darkness. She was leaning up against her car, smoking a cigarette. "Boo," she said to Rob. "Hey," he told her back. "Somebody following you," she said, jerking her head at Sistine. "This is Sistine," Rob told her. And then he turned to Sistine and said, "This is Willie May, the one I was telling you about, the one who had the bird and let it go." "So what?" said Sistine. "So nothing," said Willie May. Her glasses winked in the light from the falling Kentucky Star. "So I had me a bird." "Why are you hanging around in the parking lot trying to scare people?" Sistine asked, her voice hard and mean. "I ain't trying to scare people," said Willie May. "Willie May works here," said Rob. "That's right," said Willie May. She reached into the front pocket of her dress and pulled out a package of 8-ball gum. "You know what?" she said to Sistine. "I know you. You ain't got to introduce yourself to me. You angry. You got all the anger in the world inside you. I know angry when I meet it. Been angry most of my life." "I'm not angry," Sistine snapped. "All right," said Willie May. She opened the package of 8-ball. "You an angry liar, then. Here you go." She held out a stick of gum to Sistine. Sistine stared for a long minute at Willie May, and Willie May stared back. The last light of dusk disappeared and the darkness moved in. Rob held his breath. He wanted desperately for the two of them to like each other. When Sistine finally reached out and took the gum from Willie May, he let his breath go in a quiet whoosh. Willie May nodded at Sistine, and then she extended the pack to Rob. He took a piece and put it in his pocket for later. Willie May lit another cigarette and laughed. "Ain't that just like God?" she said. "Throwing the two of you together?" She shook her head. "This boy full of sorrow, keeping it down low in his legs, and you," she pointed her cigarette at Sistine, "you all full of anger. You got it snapping out of you like lightning. You some pair, that's the truth." She put her arms over her head and stretched, and then straightened up and stepped away from the car. Sistine stared at Willie May with her mouth open. "How tall are you?" she asked. 6'2", said Willie May, "and I gotta get on home, but first, I got some advice for you. I already gave this boy some advice. You ready for yours?" Sistine nodded, her mouth still open. "This is it. Ain't nobody gonna come and rescue you," said Willie May. She opened the car door and sat down behind the wheel. "You got to rescue yourself. You understand what I mean?" Sistine stared at Willie May. She said nothing. Willie May cranked the engine. Rob and Sistine watched her drive away. "I think she's a prophetess," said Sistine. "A what?" Rob said. A prophetess, said Sistine. They're painted all over the Sistine ceiling. They're women who God speaks through. Oh, said Rob, a prophetess. He turned the word over in his mouth. Prophetess, he said again. He nodded. That sounded right. If God was going to talk through somebody, it made sense to Rob that he would pick Willie May. That's the end of 21. So when she materializes, a lot of times material means, we know it means material like you sew with, but it just means stuff. So a lot of times when people say materialized, it means like a ghost, like it's invisible, but then it's visible. It materializes to you and you can see it. So in this case, they couldn't see her because it was dark and she was like, but then at the end, when Sistine calls her a prophetess, it does seem like she's kind of like, she knows things that other people don't know. Like she's kind of magic in a certain way. Chapter 22, there's a couple of really beautiful scenes in here about having to do with a tree and a bird. So I'll just leave it at that. Chapter 22. You out in the woods with that girl again? His father asked as soon as Rob stepped into the room. Yes, sir, said Rob. Look over here, son. His father was standing by Rob's bed. Sir, said Rob, and then his heart sank. He knew what his father had found, the meat. He had hidden it under his bed until it was time to go and feed the tiger again. Where'd this meat come from? His father asked, pointing at the bloody brown bag. Without thinking, Rob said, Beauchamp. Beauchamp, his father repeated low and dark. Beauchamp. He don't hardly pay me enough to get by, and now he's giving us his rotten meat. He thinks I ain't man enough to put meat on my own table. Rob wanted to say something, but then he thought of Beauchamp and held his tongue. I ought to teach him a lesson, his father said, and the cords in his neck stuck out like twigs. He kicked the bag of meat. I ought to, he said, making me work for less than nothing and giving us rotten meat. He went and stood in front of the gun case. He didn't unlock it. He just stood and stared and cracked his knuckles. Daddy, said Rob, but he couldn't think of anything to say after that. His mother had known how to calm his father. She would put her hand on his arm or say his name in a soft and reproachful voice, and that would be enough. But Rob didn't know how to do those things. He stood for a minute more, and then he walked over to his bed and grabbed a piece of wood and his knife. As he left the room, his father was still standing at the locked gun case, staring through the glass at his deer hunting rifle, as if he was trying to will the gun into his hands. Rob walked to the Kentucky Star sign. He sat down underneath it and leaned up against one of the cold, damp poles and started to work on the wood. But his head was too full of his father's anger and Sistine's tears. He couldn't concentrate. He looked up at the dark underside of the sign and recalled lying on a blanket, staring up at a big oak tree. His mother had been on one side of him, and his father, asleep and snoring, had been on the other. He remembered that his mother had taken hold of his hand and pointed up at the sun shining through the leaves of the tree and said, Look, Rob, I have never in my life seen a prettier color of green. Ain't it perfect? Yes, ma'am, he said, staring at the leaves. It looks like the original green, the first one God ever thought up. His mother squeezed his hand hard. That's right, she said, the first one God ever thought up. The first ever green. You and me, we see the world the same. He concentrated on that green. He let it seep through a crack in his suitcase of not thoughts and fill up his head with color. He wondered if Willie May's cricket, her bird, had been the same bright and original green, and that's what he thought about as he carved. And so he wasn't surprised when he stopped and held the wood away from himself to see a wing and a beak and a tiny eye. It was cricket, Willie May's cricket, coming to life under his knife. He worked on the bird for a long time, until it looked so real that he half expected it to break into song. When he finally went back to the room, he found his father asleep in the recliner chair. The gun case was still locked, and the bag of meat was gone. He wouldn't be able to feed the tiger in the morning. He would have to wait until Beauchamp brought him another package. Rob went and stood over his father and stared down at him. He looked at his heavy hands and the bald spot on his nodding head. He was memorizing him and trying at the same time to understand him, to make some sense of him out of his anger and his quiet, comparing it to the way he used to sing and smile. When his father jerked awake. "Hey," he said. "Hey," Rob said back. "What time is it?" "I ain't sure," Rob said. "Late, I guess." His father sighed. "Go on and get me that leg medicine." Rob brought him the tube of medicine. Outside the motel room, the world creaked and sighed. The rain started in again, and his father's hands were gentle as he applied the ointment to Rob's legs. That's the end of 22. And yes, Milka, we'll read another chapter. So I wrote down the thing about I mentioned the thing about the tree because, again, a lot of things, these little stories, that flashbacks that Rob thinks about, they show the difference between the mom and the dad and how he and his mom were very close. And that's why it's so painful and difficult for him that his mom died. And then there's also the thing about, so he carved the bird. Anyway, so now we're going to find out. He's thinking about the green, and that was a really beautiful image. The greenest green, the first green that God ever made. And then he thought about the bird and made the bird. So let's read chapter 23. The next morning, Rob put the keys to the tiger cage in one pocket and the wooden bird in the other, and set out looking for Willie May. He found her in the laundry room, sitting on one of the fold-up chairs, smoking a cigarette and staring into space. "Hey there," she said to him. "Where's your lady friend at?" "School," said Rob, "but today's only a half day." He kept his hands in his pockets. Now that he stood before Willie May, he was afraid to give her the bird. What if it was wrong? What if he had carved it wrong and it didn't look anything like the real cricket? "What are you giving me them shifty-eyed looks for?" Willie May asked. "I made you something," Rob said quickly, before he lost his nerve. "Made me something," said Willie May. "For real?" "Uh-huh. Close your eyes and hold out your hand." "I ain't," said Willie May, but she smiled and closed her eyes and put out her enormous hand, palm up. Rob carefully placed the bird in it. "You can look now," he told her. She closed her fingers around the little piece of wood, but she didn't open her eyes. She puffed on her cigarette. The long gray ash on the end of it trembled. "Don't need to look," she finally said. The cigarette ash dropped to the floor. "I know what I got in my hand. It's cricket." "But you got to look at it and tell me, did I do it right?" said Rob. "I ain't got to do nothing," said Willie May, "except stay black and die." She opened her eyes slowly, as if she was afraid she might frighten the bird into flying away. "This is the right bird," she said to him, nodding her head. "This is the one." "Now you don't got to dream about him no more," said Rob. "That's right," said Willie May. "Where'd you learn how to work a piece of wood like this?" "My mama," said Rob. Willie May nodded. "She taught you good." "Yes, ma'am," said Rob. He stared down at his legs. "I know a wooden bird ain't the same as having a real one." "It ain't," agreed Willie May, "but it soothes my heart just the same. My dad said he ain't got no jobs for me until this afternoon. He said I could help you out this morning." "Well," said Willie May, and she dropped the bird into the front pocket of her dress, "I might could find some way for you to help me." So Rob spent his morning following Willie May from room to room, stripping the dirty sheets from the beds, and while he worked, the keys jingled in his pocket. And he knew that soon Sistine would be out of school, and that she would demand again that he unlock the cage and let the tiger go. That's the end of the chapter. So they didn't go see the tiger in these 3 chapters, but I feel like some character development was going on, and suspense built up, of course, because about the conflict about letting the tiger go. And I feel sorry for the tiger because it had to go the night before without having anything to eat because Rob's dad threw the meat away. I wrote down the word shifty-eyed. That's when Willie May says, "What are you looking so shifty-eyed for?" So shifty-eyed is like when you're moving your eyes back and forth, like if you did something wrong and you feel guilty. But I'm going to ask you later and try to answer. Rob doesn't feel guilty. He feels something else when he gives her the bird, right? So thanks for listening. Make comments as always, and I'll see you soon.